Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The small town of Black Hollow, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, was once nothing more than a footnote on old maps, a place travelers passed through on their way to somewhere else. By 1954, the main road had been rerouted, leaving Black Hollow isolated, its population dwindling as coal mines closed and opportunities vanished. But for decades prior, there stood a house on Pinecrest Ridge that locals avoided, a Victorian structure with peeling blue paint and a wraparound porch that seemed to watch the road. The property belonged to the Harmon family and specifically to two stepsisters who inherited it after a series of deaths left them alone with a decaying mansion and miles of surrounding woods. According to county records, between 1928 and 1945, at least 23 travelers who passed through Black Hollow were never seen again after noting they planned to seek lodging in the area. The disappearances created barely a ripple in official documentation. A war was on, people were constantly relocating, and rural mountain communities kept to themselves. But in the fall of 1954, when a highway surveyor discovered a collection of personal effects in a hidden room of the abandoned Harmon house, authorities began piecing together what is now considered one of Appalachia's most disturbing cases of calculated predation. What makes this case particularly haunting is not merely the number of victims, but the methodical precision with which the Harmon sisters operated for nearly 2 decades without raising suspicion. Their story represents a darker truth about isolated communities and the vulnerability of travelers in an era before instant communication and digital footprints. As we reconstruct the events from official records, witness statements, and physical evidence, we confront the disturbing reality that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most ordinary. The Harmon house stood 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, positioned perfectly to catch the eye of weary travelers coming around the mountain bend. Its ornate woodwork and multiple chimneys suggested prosperity in a region where poverty had taken firm hold. According to tax records from 1925, the property was registered to Edmund Harmon, a widower who had remarried and brought together 2 families, his daughter Mabel and his new wife's daughter Ruth. Edmund had made his fortune in timber before the Depression, harvesting the ancient hardwoods that once covered these mountains. Local historical accounts suggest he was known for aggressive business practices, acquiring struggling properties during economic downturns and expanding his holdings while others lost everything. The 1927 County Business Registry lists Harmon Timber as controlling nearly 3,000 acres of prime forest, employing over 40 men during peak seasons. When the market collapsed in 1929, Edmund was one of the few who maintained his position, though his workforce dwindled to a handful of loyal employees. Neighbors from that time later recounted to authorities that the Harmon women were pleasant enough but kept to themselves. The stepsisters were described as opposites. Mabel, the elder, by 2 years, was tall and severe with dark hair, all was pulled tight against her scalp, while Ruth had a softness to her features that inspired trust. Both women were unmarried well into their 30s, unusual for the time and place. According to church records from the Black Hollow Methodist congregation, both sisters regularly attended services but declined participation in ladies' auxiliaries or community functions. The pastor's notes, reviewed during the subsequent investigation, described Ruth as appropriately devout and Mabel as present but unreachable. A local school teacher who occasionally tutored Ruth in bookkeeping later told investigators there was always something calculating about the way Mabel watched her sister interact with others. Not protective exactly. More like she was taking notes on how Ruth connected with people, studying it like a foreign language she herself couldn't speak. In spring of 1939, Edmund Harmon died of what was recorded as heart failure. Dr. Morris Beckley, who signed the death certificate, noted nothing suspicious about the passing of a 67-year-old man with a history of cardiac complaints. Edmund's widow, Lillian, followed 6 months later, leaving the Stepsisters alone in the large house. The rapid succession of deaths generated some talk in Black Hollow, but as the town doctor explained to authorities years later, in those days, without modern medications, it wasn't unusual to see a spouse follow quickly, especially older folks. We called it dying of heartbreak, though medically it was often the stress and poor self-care that followed bereavement. It was around this time that the women began offering room and board to travelers passing through. A small hand-painted sign appeared at the road junction, Harmon House. Clean rooms, hot meals. The sparse population of Black Hollow thought little of it. Taking in boarders was common practice during those hard years, and the Harmon place had plenty of room. The local postmaster noted that the sisters began receiving an unusual number of parcels and mail-ordered goods despite the wartime rationing. When questioned about their sudden prosperity, they mentioned family investments paying dividends. No one investigated further. According to Walter Pritchard, who delivered coal to the Harmon property twice yearly, the sisters maintained the house meticulously despite its size. Miss Mabel would inspect each delivery, counting the lumps like they were gold nuggets. Miss Ruth would offer coffee, making conversation while her sister checked everything. They kept that place warm when other folks were freezing, all 3 floors heated, even in the worst winters. Made me wonder where their money came from, but you didn't ask such things back then. The sisters maintained a calculated distance from the townspeople. They attended church services at the Methodist congregation every 3rd Sunday, made polite but brief conversation at the general store, and were seen driving their black Ford sedan to neighboring counties for supplies approximately once a month. Ruth handled most public interactions, while Mabel was rarely seen in town. When she did appear, witnesses later recalled her watchful silence, how her gaze seemed to evaluate rather than connect. A former store clerk told investigators in 1955, Miss Ruth would chat about the weather or ask after your family. Miss Mabel just stood behind her, taking inventory of everything and everyone. Some folks said she had a photographer's eye, remembered every detail of a person. The road leading to Black Hollow curved through dense forest before emerging near the Harmon property. In those days, with maps unreliable and signage limited, travelers often stopped to ask directions. The house's position made it the natural point for such inquiries. According to Miriam Woodson, who lived a mile down the road, folks would pull up looking lost, and the next thing you'd see is Ruth inviting them onto the porch for lemonade. By evening, their car would be parked around back, and you'd figure they'd taken a room for the night. What Woodson didn't know then was that many of those vehicles would later be driven out in the dead of night, to be abandoned at train stations or bus depots in Charleston, Roanoke, or as far as Cincinnati, creating the impression that the owners had continued their journeys. The sisters' operation was methodical. According to reconstructions based on evidence later found, they particularly welcomed single travelers or childless couples, people less likely to be immediately missed. Ruth would engage them in conversation, assessing their connections, their expected arrival elsewhere, their financial situation. Those determined to have few immediate obligations or family expectations would be offered the special suite on the 3rd floor, a room that investigators would later discover had been carefully modified. An architectural assessment conducted in 1956 revealed the extent of these modifications. The floorboards beneath the ornate rug had been treated with a substance that muffled sound. The walls had been reinforced with additional insulation, particularly those adjoining other rooms. The single window had been altered so that while it appeared normal from the outside, the inner frame was secured with hidden bolts, making it impossible to open from within. And most tellingly, the decorative iron headboard had restraint points disguised as ornamental fixtures. Herbert Connolly, a carpenter who examined the room as part of the investigation, noted, "Whoever did that work knew what they were doing. The modifications were professional, not something amateurs could manage. Made me wonder if they'd hired someone or if one of them had those skills." Either way, it was deliberate work done over time with a clear purpose. What happened in that room remained largely speculative until 1955, when authorities discovered a collection of personal journals kept by Mabel Harmon. The writing, contained in 17 leather-bound volumes, detailed the sisters' activities with clinical detachment. The journals were found sealed in a metal box buried beneath the garden shed, discovered only when new owners began renovating the long-abandoned property. The contents were immediately confiscated by state authorities and remained classified until 1963, when portions were made available to researchers under strict conditions. According to those who reviewed the material, Mabel documented each guest with photographic precision, physical characteristics, personal effects, behavior patterns, and most disturbingly, their reactions during what she termed the transition. One researcher who examined the journals noted that Mabel's handwriting remained perfectly consistent throughout, regardless of the content being described. There was no emotional variation evident in the script, no pressure changes, no size variations. Whether she was recording mundane details about the weather or describing methodical predation, the penmanship remained identical. It suggested a compartmentalization that psychologists found deeply troubling. The journals revealed that the sisters used a carefully formulated sedative added to evening tea or after-dinner coffee. Chemical analysis of residue found in glassware from the house suggested a compound containing chloral hydrate, commonly known as knockout drops, combined with other agents that would have masked the bitter taste. Once unconscious, the visitors would be secured in the third-floor room. Their personal belongings would be meticulously cataloged by Mabel, who had an accountant's precision for inventory. Valuables were sorted into categories: items to be sold through various channels, items to be kept as souvenirs, and items to be disposed of. According to Dr. Eleanor Hanning, one of the psychiatric professionals, granted access to the journals in 1963. The level of organization suggests a compartmentalization that allowed the women to separate their public personas from their predatory activities. Mabel, in particular, seemed to view their victims as resources rather than people, noting their utility and yield in financial terms. The journals documented an evolution in their methods over time. Early entries showed greater caution and more limited objectives, primarily financial gain with rapid disposal. Later entries revealed increased confidence and a disturbing expansion of the time victims were kept conscious. According to psychiatrists who reviewed the material, this pattern suggested the development of ritualized behavior driven by psychological rather than practical needs. The victims' vehicles presented both opportunity and risk. Ruth, who had learned to drive diverse automobiles during her brief employment at a motor pool during the early war years, would carefully study the particular vehicle before driving it to a predetermined abandonment point, usually a transportation hub where an unattended car might remain unquestioned for days or weeks. She would return by bus or hired car, often stopping in larger towns to mail postcards or letters she had forced the victims to write to family members or associates, explaining continued travel or sudden changes of plan. The sisters maintained this elaborate cover with remarkable attention to detail, which helped explain why no investigations connected the disappearances for nearly 2 decades. One such letter, discovered in 1962 during a review of case materials, was particularly revealing. Written apparently by Robert Keller, a pharmaceutical salesman who disappeared in 1943, it informed his employer that he had decided to seek opportunities out west following a chance encounter with an old colleague. The handwriting analysis confirmed it was indeed Keller's writing, though the pressure patterns suggested duress. The postmark showed it had been mailed from St. Louis, creating the impression Keller had traveled far from West Virginia. His vehicle was later found abandoned at a bus terminal in Louisville, Kentucky, halfway between Black Hollow and St. Louis, reinforcing the narrative of westward travel. What became of the travelers after their valuables were cataloged remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The physical evidence discovered on the property was limited by time and deliberate obscurement. However, soil analysis conducted in the densely wooded acres behind the house revealed chemical anomalies consistent with decomposition. A thorough search in 1956 uncovered a series of unmarked areas where the ground had been repeatedly disturbed over many years. Forensic techniques of the time were insufficient to identify individual remains, but authorities estimated that the disturbed areas could account for approximately 15 to 20 bodies. The pattern of these sites, distributed in a rough semicircle approximately 200 yards from the house, suggested a systematic approach to disposal designed to prevent accidental discovery through concentration. More telling were the modifications discovered in the house's basement. Behind a false wall accessed through the coal cellar, investigators found a room approximately 12 feet square, with a concrete floor that sloped toward a central drain. The walls had been lined with asbestos sheeting and various implements, including surgical tools, butchering equipment, and chemical containers, were found stored in precise order on metal shelving. Analysis of residue found in the drain trap revealed human tissue and blood of multiple types. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Raymond Doherty in October 1955, the space appears designed for efficient processing of human remains, with consideration given to disposal, sanitization, and sound suppression. The construction of this hidden room would have required considerable knowledge and effort. County records indicated that in 1940, the Harmon sisters hired a contractor from Charleston to modernize the basement plumbing. The contractor, located by investigators in 1956 and interviewed, recalled installing drainage and water lines to what he was told would be a canning kitchen. They were specific about the slope of the floor and the capacity of the drain, he stated, said they did a lot of preserving and needed proper facilities. Nothing seemed unusual about it. Lots of rural folks put up preserves in those days. They paid cash, no questions asked. The question that haunted investigators and later researchers was the exact nature of the sisters' motivations. Financial gain provided partial explanation. The victims' possessions and cash certainly contributed to the women's livelihood during economically depressed times. However, the journals hinted at deeper psychological factors. Mabel's writings, particularly entries from the early 1940s, referenced the transcendence of ordinary boundaries and the privilege of witnessing true vulnerability. These passages suggested that beyond material gain, the sisters derived psychological satisfaction from their complete power over their victims. Dr. Hanning noted, "There is evidence of shared delusion with the dominant partner, apparently Mabel, providing justification that the more hesitant partner, Ruth, gradually internalized. The writings suggest Ruth initially participated out of loyalty and financial necessity, but eventually developed her own investment in their activities." One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the sisters' method of selecting victims. The journals revealed a careful assessment process, with Ruth engaging travelers in conversation designed to elicit specific information. According to Dr. Hanning's analysis, they developed a systematic screening protocol evaluating potential victims based on isolation factors, how connected they were to others, how immediately they would be missed, how traceable their movements were. It wasn't opportunistic predation, it was calculated risk assessment. The sisters' operation continued through the war years and into the early 1950s, adapting to changing circumstances with calculating precision. When gasoline rationing reduced casual travel, they adjusted their criteria to focus on military personnel on leave or individuals traveling for family emergencies, people whose irregular schedules might explain delayed communications. After the war, As automobile travel increased again, they returned to their previous pattern but became more selective, focusing on travelers who mentioned few connections or time constraints. By 1951, the rerouting of the main highway reduced traffic past their property significantly. County records indicate the sisters began selling parcels of their land, suggesting a change in financial circumstances. Their final known victim was Wilson Carey, a jewelry salesman from Ohio whose vehicle was found abandoned at a bus station in Huntington, West Virginia in August 1954. A letter in Carey's handwriting, postmarked from Cincinnati and addressed to his employer, explained that he had decided to take a sales position with a competitor and would not be returning. The deception might have succeeded, except that Carey's sample case, containing distinctive pieces cataloged by his company, was discovered among the items in the hidden room of the Harmon House the following year. What prompted the sisters to abandon their property in late 1954 remains unclear. The journals end abruptly in September of that year, with a final entry that reads simply, "The signs are unfavorable. We must relocate." Local speculation suggested they had become aware of increased scrutiny, possibly due to inquiries about Carey or other recent disappearances. Contemporary newspaper accounts from neighboring counties reveal that around this time, state police had increased patrols along rural routes following complaints about harassment of travelers. While not directly connected to the Harmon case, this increased law enforcement presence may have prompted the sisters to abandon their operation. Whatever the reason, neighbors reported that the sisters departed without announcement, the house left with furniture still in place, as if they intended to return. They never did. The subsequent investigation began almost accidentally. In March 1955, the county sent surveyor Thomas Adkins to assess the property for back taxes. Finding the house unlocked and apparently abandoned, Adkins conducted a thorough examination. His discovery of a locked door in the third-floor hallway, concealed behind a standing wardrobe, led to the first revelation of the sisters' activities. In his statement to authorities, Adkins described the moment. "I moved the wardrobe thinking there might be water damage to check, and there was this door, solid oak, with 3 separate locks. Didn't match the rest of the house at all. I had a pry bar in my truck, and being county business, figured I was authorized to check all spaces. When I finally got it open, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing at first. Piles of wallets, suitcases, watches, all organized like a store inventory. The room contained hundreds of personal items, wallets, jewelry, identification papers, and luggage tags bearing names that would eventually be matched to missing persons reports, spanning 2 decades. Adkins immediately contacted authorities, setting in motion the comprehensive investigation that would ultimately reveal the full scope of the Harmon sisters' crimes. The collection of belongings found in that hidden room told its own disturbing story. Items were arranged chronologically with tags indicating date of acquisition and estimated value. Clothing had been sorted by size and quality, with finer pieces apparently set aside for resale. Documents, driver's licenses, social security cards, military identification were filed alphabetically in metal boxes. Personal correspondence had been bundled and labeled, suggesting the sisters reviewed it for useful information or potential complications. The methodical organization spoke to a disturbing level of detachment and calculation. Despite extensive efforts by federal authorities, the sisters themselves were never located. Descriptions were circulated nationally, but in the days before computerized records and instant communication, their trail quickly went cold. Investigators believed they likely separated and assumed new identities, possibly using documentation taken from their victims. The investigation revealed that, in the months prior to their disappearance, the sisters had made multiple trips to various cities, including Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Richmond. Bank records showed significant withdrawals, suggesting preparation for extended relocation. A report filed by FBI investigator Harold Morrow in December 1956 concluded, "The methodical nature of their previous activities suggests the subjects would have prepared thoroughly for relocation, including establishing new identities and securing finances. Given their demonstrated ability to maintain false personas over extended periods, identification through conventional means is unlikely. The most disturbing discovery came in June 1956, when workers demolishing an unstable section of the Harmon house found a hidden space beneath the floorboards of Ruth's bedroom. The cavity, approximately 3 feet deep and 4 feet square, contained what appeared to be personal mementos taken from victims. Wedding rings arranged on a velvet display pad, driver's licenses organized chronologically in a photo album, and most disturbingly, a collection of small glass vials containing what analysis later confirmed were human teeth, each container meticulously labeled with initials and dates. The contractor who made the discovery, Vernon Miller, later told the local newspaper, "I've been in construction 40 years, seen all kinds of things people hide in their houses, cash, liquor during Prohibition, love letters, but nothing like that. It wasn't just what was there. It was how careful everything was arranged, like a museum display. Made my skin crawl thinking about the kind of mind that would create something like that." According to psychiatric evaluator Dr. Honning, the organization of these items suggests a trophy collection, indicating that beyond financial motivation, the subjects derived significant psychological gratification from maintaining proximity to evidence of their power over their victims. The ritualistic aspect of collection and display suggests compulsive behavior, characteristic of predators who require psychological souvenirs of their activities. Further examination of the house in late 1956 revealed additional modifications suggesting long-term planning. The attic contained a radio receiver capable of picking up police frequencies, allowing the sisters to monitor law enforcement activities in the region. A concealed space in the pantry held documentation for multiple bank accounts in different names, spread across 3 states. According to financial investigators, the sisters had developed an elaborate system for dispersing and laundering funds derived from their activities. The Harmon case gradually faded from public attention, overshadowed by more sensational crimes of the late 1950s. The house itself was eventually demolished in 1958 after being deemed structurally unsound, and the property remained undeveloped. Local residents, however, continued to avoid the area, creating what amounted to an unofficial memorial to the victims. As one Black Hollow resident told a visiting journalist in 1962, "That ground won't ever be right for building or growing. Some things sink too deep to be covered over." The last official action related to the case came in 1963, when the FBI formally classified the Harmon file as inactive pending new information. By that time, investigators had positively identified 16 victims through personal effects found on the property, with another 11 individuals considered highly probable, based on travel records and last known locations. The true total will likely never be known. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Harmon case was how thoroughly the sisters blended into their community, maintaining unremarkable public personas while systematically preying on travelers for nearly 2 decades. Their neighbors described them as reserved but proper, keeping to themselves but not unfriendly, and the kind of women who always remembered your birthday with a card but never invited you inside their home. This ability to compartmentalize, to maintain a veneer of normalcy while orchestrating calculated predation, disturbed investigators and psychological researchers far more than many more visibly violent crimes of the era. Dr. Hanning observed, "The capacity to sustain dual existences, one socially appropriate, the other predatory, without apparent psychological distress, represents an extreme form of compartmentalization rarely documented in female offenders of this period." In a cruel twist that underscored the sisters' meticulous planning, authorities discovered in 1957 that they had maintained subscription service to several newspapers from cities where they frequently abandoned victims' vehicles. Clipping files found in the basement indicated they followed any reports of discovered abandoned cars or missing persons investigations, apparently to track whether their deceptions had succeeded. According to FBI analysis, in at least 3 instances where investigations appeared to be advancing, subsequent victims were processed with additional precautions, suggesting the sisters actively adapted their methods based on law enforcement techniques. A 1958 Bureau report noted the subjects demonstrated awareness of investigative methodologies and modified their approach accordingly. This capacity for tactical adaptation distinguishes the case from many comparable offender patterns where behavior typically remains static or escalates without strategic adjustment. The impact of the Harmon case extended beyond criminal investigation. The revelations contributed to changing practices in missing persons cases, particularly involving travelers. Law enforcement agencies began implementing improved cross-jurisdiction communication protocols, recognizing that mobile victims created investigative challenges that local departments were ill-equipped to address independently. The discovery that the sisters had exploited the isolation of rural communities and the limited connectivity of the era led to discussions about the vulnerability of travelers and the need for more comprehensive tracking of transient populations. While these concerns would not be fully addressed until the advent of computerized databases decades later, the Harmon case provided early impetus for such developments. For the residents of Black Hollow and surrounding communities, the revelations created lasting trauma. Margaret Simmons, who operated the general store where the sisters occasionally shopped, expressed the sentiment shared by many locals: to think we sold them flour and sugar and chatted about the weather, never knowing what was happening in that house, makes you question everyone you think you know. Some folks here never got past that, the idea that evil could look so ordinary, so familiar. The final chapter of the Harmon story came unexpectedly in April of 1969, when a nursing home administrator in Tupelo, Mississippi, contacted authorities regarding a recently deceased resident. The woman, who had lived in the facility under the name Margaret Wilson since 1965, had begun speaking erratically during her final days, describing in disturbing detail activities that matched the Harmon case. Nursing staff reported that as her health deteriorated, Mrs. Wilson became increasingly agitated, often addressing someone named Mabel in the empty chair beside her bed. According to night nurse Evelyn Davis, she would carry on conversations like Mabel was sitting right there, talking about people they had processed and whether they had done right to leave West Virginia. Most of us thought it was just the dementia, until the head nurse recognized some details from an old magazine article she'd read. Among her personal effects was a distinctive cameo brooch, later identified as belonging to Eleanor Chambers, a school teacher who disappeared while traveling through West Virginia in 1942. Fingerprint comparison confirmed that Margaret Wilson was Ruth Harmon. According to staff members, in her final lucid conversation, Ruth had whispered, "Mabel went first, back in '62. Pneumonia. She never broke, not even at the end, but I'm tired of remembering for both of us." Ruth's medical records from the nursing home, reviewed by authorities after her identification, revealed a woman physically diminished but mentally intact until her final illness. She had been admitted with chronic respiratory problems, claiming to be a childless widow from Tennessee. The facility administrator noted that she paid her bills promptly, always in cash, and received no visitors or correspondence during her 4-year residence. She was polite but distant with other residents, the administrator reported. She participated in group activities occasionally, but formed no close relationships. Staff described her as pleasant but forgettable, the same words that had been used to describe Ruth Harmon in Black Hollow decades earlier. Ruth's remains were cremated before authorities could conduct a thorough examination. The nursing home staff reported that she had no visitors during her 4 years in residence and received no mail. She paid her monthly fees in cash, delivered by money order from varying locations. The trail of Mabel Harmon remained cold, with Ruth's claim of her death in 1962 impossible to verify. Some investigators speculated that Ruth's statement might have been a final deception intended to discourage continued search for her sister. Following Ruth's identification and death, a final search was conducted for any trace of Mabel Harmon. Records from hospitals, nursing facilities, and death certificates in multiple states were examined for women matching her description or using known aliases associated with the sisters. No conclusive evidence of her fate was discovered. As the investigating officer noted in the supplemental report, given the subject's demonstrated capacity for identity concealment and geographic mobility, Mabel Harmon may have successfully established an entirely new identity unconnected to any known aliases or patterns. Absent specific intelligence, identification remains highly improbable. The Harmon case has since become a subject of study for criminologists and psychologists specializing in predatory behavior. The sisters' methods, their patient selection process, their calculated risk management, their ability to maintain dual existences, represent what Dr. Irving Matthews of Columbia University described in his 1967 analysis as perhaps the most sustained and methodical predation case documented in modern American criminal history. What makes the case particularly noteworthy is not just the duration of their activities, but the complete absence of escalation or deviation that typically characterizes such behavior. Their methods remained consistent, controlled, and businesslike throughout, suggesting a psychological compartmentalization rare even among serial predators. Dr. Matthews observed, "The Harmon case challenges conventional profiles of violent offenders in multiple respects. The gender of the perpetrators, their relational dynamic, the economic component of their motivation, and, most significantly, their capacity to maintain behavioral consistency over an extended period without the pattern-breaking episodes typically observed in comparable cases. All these factors distinguish this case as an important outlier in the study of predatory behavior. Today, the location where the Harmon house once stood remains undeveloped, a cleared area slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Occasional visitors to Black Hollow, now little more than a cluster of buildings around a single intersection, might hear locals still refer to the ridge as the Sisters' Place, though few remain who remember the actual events. County records list the property as unbuildable due to soil instability, though local belief suggests the designation had more to do with the property's history than its geology. A former county commissioner interviewed for a regional historical project in 1967 admitted, "The soil studies were real enough, but we would have found a way to approve development if anyone had really pushed for it. Truth is, nobody wanted to build there, and nobody wanted to explain to outsiders why. Easier to just declare it unsuitable and be done with it." The road that once brought travelers past the Harmon house has been reduced to a gravel track, rarely used and partially overgrown, but longtime residents of the area still report an instinctive unease when passing the turnoff to Pinecrest Ridge. As former Black Hollow Sheriff Doherty, then in his 80s, told an interviewer in 1968, "Some places absorb what happens there. Not in any ghostly way, I don't believe in that nonsense, but in how they sit in your mind. That property up there, it sits wrong in the mind. Always will." The methodical nature of the Harmon sisters' crimes, their ability to operate undetected for so many years in a small community, and the calculated normality they projected continue to unsettle those who study the case. Their legacy is not one of sensational violence, but of the quiet horror that can exist behind unremarkable facades, the monster that looks exactly like everyone else. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the Harmon case is not what it reveals about the extremes of human behavior, but how effectively such extremes can be concealed behind everyday appearances. As investigators noted in their final assessment, the subjects maintained social integration while engaging in predatory behavior over an extended period, suggesting a capacity for behavioral compartmentalization that enabled them to satisfy community expectations while pursuing deviant objectives. This duality represents the most troubling aspect of the case. the implication that extensive predatory activity can coexist with apparent normalcy. The question that remains unanswered, that continues to trouble researchers and casual observers alike, is how many other Ruth and Mabel Harmons might exist, moving through ordinary communities, nodding politely to neighbors, while cultivating private realms of calculated predation. As Dr. Matthews concluded in his analysis, the truly disturbing aspect of the Harmon case is not its exceptionality, but rather the possibility that it represents merely the instance where the facade slipped enough to be noticed. In the decades since, the Harmon case has largely faded from public knowledge, referenced occasionally in specialized criminology texts or as a footnote in discussions of Appalachian history. The site where travelers once turned off the mountain road, seeing the house with its wraparound porch and the promise of rest, is now bypassed by a modern highway that carries thousands past the area daily. Travelers, unaware of what once waited for the weary in that isolated corner of the mountains. A small collection of items recovered from the Harmon house remains in storage at the State Police Archives, unclaimed by any family members of the identified victims. Among these objects is a guest book found in the front parlor, containing signatures and brief comments from travelers who stayed at the house, or at least those who were permitted to depart. The final entry, dated August 17, 1954, reads simply, "Comfortable accommodations and kind hospitality in these beautiful mountains. W.C., Cincinnati." The handwriting matches samples from Wilson Carey, the jewelry salesman who would become their final known victim. The ledger books that documented the sisters' financial operations revealed a disturbing precision. Each victim was assigned a case number, with detailed accounting of assets acquired, expenses incurred in disposal, and net profit calculated to the penny. According to the forensic accountant who examined the records, the level of organization suggests individuals with significant financial acumen. The systematic conversion of assets to untraceable currency, the distribution of funds across multiple banking institutions, and the careful documentation of transactions indicate sophisticated financial planning unusual for the period and context. And perhaps that ignorance is merciful. For to drive those winding Appalachian roads with full knowledge of the Harmon sisters is to be reminded that danger sometimes wears the most ordinary face, that predation can hide behind a polite nod and an offered cup of tea, that the monster in human form does not announce itself, but rather cultivates your trust, your relief at finding shelter, your gratitude for hospitality, right until the moment your tea tastes slightly bitter, and the room begins to spin, and you realize, too, late, that you have accepted invitation from those who see in you not a fellow traveler, but merely resources to be harvested. For those who study the darkness that humans are capable of, the Harmon case remains a somber reminder that evil rarely announces itself with convenient warnings or distinctive appearances. It welcomes you in, asks about your journey, offers you comfort, and waits for the precise moment when you are most vulnerable. The true horror of the Harmon sisters lies not in supernatural curses, but in the calculated patience with which they transformed hospitality into predation, and the unremarkable faces they showed to the world while doing so. As one investigator noted in his personal journal, later donated to the Criminal Justice Archives at Marshall University, "What haunts me is not what we found in that house, though God knows that was bad enough. It's the thought that I might have driven past that place myself, seen those women standing on their porch, and thought nothing of it. Might even have stopped to ask directions, accepted a glass of water. We look for monsters to have horns and fangs, but the real ones just look like anybody else. That's the thing that keeps me awake at night." The legacy of the Harmon case extended beyond the immediate investigation into realms of academic study and practical law enforcement. The sisters' methodical approach to victim selection, their strategic use of geographic isolation, and their exploitation of an era's limited communication infrastructure provided a case study in predatory behavior that influenced subsequent investigative approaches to missing persons cases. The Harmon sisters remind us that the most effective predators are not those who lurk in shadows or announce their intentions, but those who create environments of false security, who understand and exploit human vulnerability, who recognize that a weary traveler's greatest desire is simply a safe place to rest. In that understanding, and in their willingness to weaponize it, lay their true monstrosity, not in any supernatural curse, but in the calculated perversion of hospitality into a mechanism of predation. And so the story of the Harmon sisters enters the darkest chapter of Appalachian history, not as legend or folklore, but as documented reality, a case that reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous path is not the one that leads through dark woods, but the one that leads to a welcoming porch, a comfortable chair, and a cup of tea offered by those who have perfected the disguise of normalcy. As we conclude this documented case, it's worth noting that while the physical evidence of the Harmon sisters' activities was substantial, many questions remain unanswered. The full extent of their victims may never be known, particularly those from the earliest years of their operation. Investigators estimated that the actual number could be significantly higher than the 27 individuals officially linked to the case. What distinguished the Harmon case from many similar predatory patterns was the sisters' remarkable self-control and strategic thinking. Unlike many violent offenders who escalate over time or become increasingly reckless, the Harmons maintained consistent methodology throughout their active period. According to criminologist Dr. Lawrence Feldman, who reviewed the case in 1964, most predatory behavior follows a trajectory of escalation and eventual deterioration of control. The Harmon sisters demonstrated unusual discipline, modifying their approach based on external factors rather than psychological escalation. This suggests a fundamentally different motivational structure than typically observed. The psychological dynamic between the sisters remains one of the most analyzed aspects of the case. The available evidence suggests a symbiotic relationship in which Mabel provided the strategic direction and emotional detachment, while Ruth facilitated the practical execution through her ability to engage with potential victims. Dr. Hanning's assessment concluded the complementary nature of their psychological profiles and behavioral roles created a predatory entity more effective than either individual could have been independently. Ruth's capacity for social engagement combined with Mabel's strategic thinking formed a particularly dangerous combination. This partnership aspect has made the Harmon case significant in the study of collaborative predatory behavior. Most documented cases involve male-female pairs with sexual components or dominant-submissive dynamics. The Harmon sisters represented a different model, two women operating as functional equals with complementary skills, motivated primarily by practical gain and what appears to have been a shared psychological gratification derived from control. The journals recovered from the property provided disturbing insight into how the sisters viewed their victims. Entries frequently referred to travelers as resources, opportunities, or acquisitions, rather than as individuals. Mabel's clinical descriptions focused on practical aspects, estimated net worth, potential complications, disposal logistics, with almost no acknowledgement of the humanity of those they targeted. As Dr. Matthews noted, the level of objectification evident in the documentation suggests a profound detachment that facilitated their activities. The victims were not people to them, but rather problems to solve and assets to extract. One particularly troubling aspect of the case was the sisters' adaptation to changing circumstances. When gasoline rationing during World War II reduced casual travel, they modified their target criteria rather than suspending activities. Their awareness of how the war affected missing persons investigations, with authorities often assuming that disappeared individuals had enlisted or relocated for war work, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of systemic vulnerabilities. A 1957 FBI analysis observed, the subjects exploited societal disruption during wartime to mask their activities, recognizing that investigative resources were directed elsewhere and that population mobility created cover for disappearances. This opportunistic adaptation to external conditions indicates a level of situational awareness uncommon among typical offenders. The Harmon house itself became a subject of extensive analysis. Architectural experts who examined the property noted how its design had been subtly modified to serve the sisters' purposes. Soundproofing had been added to strategic areas. Sightlines from neighboring properties had been blocked by carefully positioned shrubbery, and multiple exit routes had been established. The modifications were made gradually over years, integrated so naturally into the property that they raised no questions among occasional visitors. As one investigator noted, everything about that house was designed to look normal while serving a hidden purpose. The welcoming porch that gave them clear views of approaching vehicles. The dining room positioned so that drugged individuals could be moved to the stairs without being visible from outside windows. The basement layout that allowed for efficient processing. It was like looking at a pleasant mask and suddenly recognizing the predator's face beneath it. The case dramatically affected the small community of Black Hollow. Many residents reported feelings of guilt and disbelief that such activities could have continued in their midst without detection. Church records from 1956 indicate that the pastor conducted a special service of community healing after the full details became public. According to newspaper accounts, attendance was nearly universal among the remaining population. Miriam Woodson, who had observed travelers stopping at the Harmon house for years, later told investigators, "I keep thinking about the people I saw pull up there, how they might have waved as they drove past my place. I wonder how many of them I was the last person to see, besides those women. That's a terrible thing to carry." The economic effects of the case on Black Hollow were severe. Tourism, already declining due to the highway rerouting, virtually disappeared after news reports linked the town to the Harmon sisters. Several businesses closed within a year of the revelations, accelerating the community's gradual fade toward ghost town status. By 1960, the population had declined to fewer than 200 residents, compared to nearly 500 in 1940. One lingering question that troubled investigators was how the sisters had developed their methodology. Nothing in their known backgrounds explained their evolution into calculated predators. Both had received typical educations for rural women of their era. Ruth had worked briefly as a secretary for a lumber company and later at the wartime motor pool. Mabel had assisted with bookkeeping for her father's timber business. Neither had criminal records or documented behavioral issues prior to the beginning of their activities. This apparent emergence of sophisticated predatory behavior without precursors led some researchers to suggest that their documented crimes might not have represented the beginning of their activities. Dr. Hanning proposed, "The level of refinement evident in their methodology suggests previous experience. While no earlier cases have been linked to the subjects, the possibility exists that they engaged in similar behavior at lower intensity, perhaps during their father's lifetime, developing the techniques later deployed more extensively." Some support for this theory came from re-examination of Edmund Harmon's business records. Several of his timber competitors experienced financial reverses after key employees disappeared under unclear circumstances in the early 1930s. While no direct connection was established, the pattern bore similarities to the sisters' later exploitation of vulnerable travelers. However, without concrete evidence, these earlier disappearances remained officially unconnected to the Harmon case. The impact of the case extended to popular culture, though often indirectly. While the Harmon sisters were rarely mentioned by name in mainstream entertainment, their methodology influenced fictional portrayals of rural predation in several novels and films of the 1960s. The concept of isolated properties offering dangerous hospitality to travelers became a recurring theme in American horror narratives, drawing partly on the psychological impact of the real case. For law enforcement, the case provided valuable lessons about the limitations of localized investigation in addressing crimes involving transient victims. The fragmentation of missing persons reports across multiple jurisdictions had allowed the pattern to continue unrecognized for years. This recognition contributed to the development of more centralized information-sharing systems in subsequent decades. As former FBI investigator Morrow reflected in a 1968 interview, the Harmon case showed us a blind spot in how we approached disappearances. We were set up to investigate crimes within jurisdictions, but these women operated between them, exploiting the gaps. Every victim was reported missing somewhere else, so nobody saw the pattern until we had all the pieces in one place. That's a lesson we've tried to apply since. The psychological assessment of Ruth Harmon during her final illness provided additional insights into the case. According to the attending physician, as her physical condition deteriorated, her psychological compartmentalization began to fail. She increasingly confused past and present, sometimes addressing staff as if they were potential victims, other times expressing distress about what happens in the basement. The nursing home chaplain who spoke with her in her final days reported she would alternate between periods of apparent normality and moments of disturbing clarity about her past. During one conversation, she told me, "We provided a service, really. We helped people disappear who wanted to be somewhere else. Everyone who came to our door was looking for something. We just made sure they found it." When I asked what they were looking for, she smiled and said, "An ending." This rationalization, consistent with entries found in Mabel's journals, suggested that the sisters had constructed an elaborate justification for their actions, recasting predation as a form of service or fulfillment. According to Dr. Henning, this type of neutralization technique is common among long-term offenders, allowing them to maintain self-image despite their actions. What makes the Harmon case unusual is the consistency of this justification over time, and its apparently shared nature between the partners. The case files, partially declassified in 1963 for research purposes, became required study at the FBI Academy during the development of the Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s. The Harmon sisters represented an important case study in how predatory individuals could operate within ordinary social structures while completely compartmentalizing their criminal activities. As one instructor at the Academy noted, the sisters demonstrated that the most dangerous predators aren't necessarily those who can't function in society, but rather those who can function perfectly well, who understand social expectations well enough to satisfy them while pursuing their own objectives. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the case was its illustration of how vulnerability creates opportunity for predation. The travelers who stopped at the Harmon house were typically people in transition between jobs, relationships, or life phases. Their temporary disconnection from established social networks made them ideal targets, less likely to be immediately missed, their disappearances more easily explained or rationalized by those who knew them. This exploitation of transitional vulnerability remains relevant in modern crime analysis, as Dr. Matthews observed in his final assessment of the case. The methodology demonstrated by the Harmon sisters represents a template for predation that transcends their specific time and context. The identification of vulnerable targets in geographic and social transition, the creation of false security through performed normalcy, and the exploitation of systemic gaps in protective oversight, these elements recur in predatory crime across diverse contexts. Today, the Harmon case exists primarily in specialized academic literature and the institutional memory of law enforcement agencies. For the general public, the sisters have faded from awareness, their activities obscured by time and overshadowed by more recent, more extensively documented cases. But for those who study the darker aspects of human behavior, they remain a disturbing example of how effectively predation can disguise itself as normalcy. The land where the Harmon house stood has been reclaimed by the Appalachian forest, with little to suggest what once occurred there. Black Hollow itself has dwindled to a handful of structures, most abandoned, a hollow place name on maps that few consult. But the case itself retains its power to unsettle precisely because of its ordinariness, because it reminds us that danger need not announce itself with obvious warning signs, but can instead offer a comfortable chair, a sympathetic ear, and a cup of tea that tastes just slightly wrong. For investigators who devoted years to the case, this was its most troubling lesson. As Sheriff Dougherty reflected in his final interview before his death in 1971, most evil in this world doesn't come at you like something from a horror picture. It doesn't have fangs or claws. It looks just like your neighbor, your friend, the nice lady who remembers your birthday. The Harmon women taught me that the real monsters are the ones you'd never notice until it's too late. In the end, the story of the Harmon sisters stands as a documented reminder that the most effective predators are not those who exist outside normal society, but those who understand its expectations well enough to satisfy them while concealing their true nature. Their legacy is not in supernatural curses or ghostly legends, but in the very real horror of calculated human predation hiding behind the most ordinary of facades. As we conclude this account, perhaps the most fitting epitaph comes from the final pages of Dr. Matthew's analysis. The Harmon case compels us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the boundary between normality and monstrosity is not clearly marked by external signifiers, but can be hidden behind the most convincing performance of ordinary humanity. The sisters remind us that sometimes the most dangerous path is not the one that leads through darkness, but the one that leads to a welcoming door held open by hands that have done terrible things, and will do them again once the door closes behind you.